you should be intentional with the information that you're taking in. I've read so many books in the last couple of years. Not so many, but I've read a lot of books. I've read maybe 20 books in the past 2 or 3 years, and I document them at the end. So I write notes on each chapter. So I have a little library, which is great. You know, I've got notes every time I want to go back to a book. But what I used to do is I would take notes on a book, and I would take so many notes at the end of each chapter. So I'd read the chapter, I would document the notes, and I'd be like, okay, what have I learned from this chapter? And then I would try and capture every single thing. Sometimes I'd be taking down 15 bullet points, 15, 20 bullet points to try and capture it all, because I don't want to miss anything. But over the last 3 years, I've come to realize that even just taking one thing from a chapter and putting it into action, that's way more important than taking the notes. What have you learned from this book? How does it help you in your life? How are you going to put that into action? That's a way more purposeful way of taking in information. Like, I've had daily schedules where I've been like, okay, well, I'm going to watch a motivational video, I'm going to watch a self-help video, and I'm going to watch half an hour of a podcast every single day, with no exceptions. But the problem with information overload is it's not possible to put that much information into practice. It's just not physically possible. Sometimes it's better to less is more sometimes. But what are you doing with that information? Like, a good example is I read Atomic Habits a year ago. Great book, I loved it, and it's one of the books that I actually started putting things into action instead of just reading things on a page and just writing them down. But I read this book because I saw one of my colleagues actually reading it. I was like, oh, you know what, I've heard of this book before. My colleague's reading it. I've got to read this. Maybe it gave me some fire in my belly to read it. But a year later, the guy who read this book first, he wasn't even putting these simple things into practice. You know, like the art of habit forming, you know, making it obvious, making how to make habits stick, good habits stick, and bad habits, how to erase them. He wasn't putting these into practice. So he's a perfect example of someone who's, you know, always wanting to read, always wanting to take in information, be an information consumer. But what's the point if you're not going to put it into practice? You might as well have just not read the book. Because when you read these books as well and you listen to these podcasts, it gives you a sort of sense of achievement. It makes you feel like a scholar, makes you feel like you're a little bit more clever than the average person. But what's the use of that if you're not going to put in the information that you're actually learning into use? What's the point of being a scholar or actually learning stuff if you're not going to actually do what the book says? You might as well just be looking at a wall, because yeah, it's not worth it. What's the point of reading Atomic Habits if you're not actually going to put it into practice? You've just wasted time reading. Just take one thing from the chapter. What can I learn? How can this help me in my life? How does this relate to my life? If I've got a habit that I need to kick, what habits do I need to kick? What good habits do I need to make stick? It's all very well reading about it, but if you're not going to put it into practice, then don't bother. Application is the most important thing. Same with podcasts. I was listening to so many podcasts, and I think podcasts, it depends on what the topics are. Like, you can have podcasts on and you're not necessarily going to be taking in all the information. It's just something in the background. You know, it's like the law of attraction. You might put something into practice gradually or like randomly. Doesn't need to be so purposeful, but still, you are still getting information overload. So you just need to be careful of that. So be more intentional. Put things into practice instead of just reading them. Become a doer.